On this example, we're going to find the inverse of this function. This is a square root function, so we need to find the domain. If you're not already given the domain, which you are on this one, you would have to use the expression inside the square root. So we would say that x minus 1 has to be greater than or equal to 0, and then you're just going to isolate the x. So that's exactly the domain we were given. So it means that the domain goes from 1 to infinity. And the range is going to be based on the constant term. So because we have a positive 2 as a constant term, we can assume that this is going to be the range from 2 to infinity. And we can make sure of that by sketching the graph. This is the square root function graph, shifted 1 unit to the right and 2 units up. So the graph is going to end up here, 1 unit to the right and 2 units up, going roughly like that. So now there we can corroborate that it goes from 1 to infinity, the domain, and the range from 2 to infinity. Now we're going to actually find the inverse function by following the steps that we already know. Y is equal to the square root of x minus 1 plus 2. Our goal right now is to have the square root isolated on the right side and everything else on the left-hand side. Y minus 2 and the square root of x minus 1. Then in order to get rid of the square root, we're going to square both sides of the equation. So we're going to square them both. After that, we're going to have y minus 2 squared. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have just x minus 1. And finally, we're going to isolate the x. So I'm going to keep going over here. This is going to be y minus 2 squared plus 1. That's equal to x. And then just do the usual drill. We're going to write it as x minus 2 squared plus 1. And that's our inverse function. So let's write it down over here. X minus 2 squared plus 1. And we're going to use what we know about the original function. If this is the domain, on the inverse function is going to end up being the range. So the range goes from 1 to infinity using a bracket on the 1. And the domain is going to be the range of the original function. So we're going to use a bracket. And we're going to go from 2 to infinity. If you want to sketch this graph, the graph of this inverse function is a U-shaped function. It is a quadratic, shifted 2 units to the right, 1, 2, and 1 unit up. If we sketch the whole graph, we would have a U roughly looking like that. But because we cannot use the whole graph because that function is not one-to-one, we have to look at this domain. And we have to make sure that we just use what the domain is asking us to use. So it is only asking us to use the part of the graph that it's going from 2 to plus infinity. So that's the right of the graph, this side of the graph, and we're gonna get rid of the other side of the graph, making it a one-to-one function. And if you use the test by sketching this imaginary line, y is equal to x, it should end up being a reflection of the original function over that line. And it looks like we got it right.